Hi, thanks very much for joining me. Today I'm going to talk about evolutions in approach to dysmenorrhea. I want to just begin, as is the custom in Australia where I'm from, by acknowledging the traditional owners of country throughout Australia. I'd like to acknowledge their continuing connections to land, waters and culture, and pay my respects to elders past and present, as well as to any First Nations people who might be joining and listening to this presentation. So, in the time I've got available to me today, I'm going to say a few words to help further set the scene about both the history of approaches to women's pain in general and dysmenorrhea in particular. This talk draws on my own research into these issues, including my PhD and resulting book on the history of endometriosis, as well as my training and expertise as a lawyer who specialises in issues to do with stigma, human rights, and health. In the time I've got, I want to underscore just a few key points which I think are important for this conversation. The first is that medicine has, as a general rule, and this is a generalisation, of course, not always done well at grappling with women's accounts of pain. And I say this while, of course, acknowledging that there is also a great deal of good work that's being done to deal with and address women's pain, and I'll come back to that at the end. But historically, menstrual pain was often dismissed or trivialised, including in gynecological texts, medical training and practice. If we look back at how menstrual pain was described historically, for instance, we'll find that most often physicians were taught that no follow-up investigations or treatments were needed for women who complained of it. In a comment that was typical of discourses around the turn of the 20th century, for example, one physician wrote, and I'll quote here, "A sensitive patient feels acutely what a strong one would hardly notice. Such a patient may suffer much from the menstrual congestion, although there is nothing abnormal except her sensitiveness. Nothing will cure such menstrual pain." It was very common in historic medical texts for physicians to speak this way and to claim to have observed a typical psychic demeanour or personality profile in women who complained of pelvic pain at the menstrual cycle or during sexual intercourse. So the author that I've just cited, Herman, argued that dysmenorrhea occurs in sensitive women. The subjects of it are often tall, well-nourished, not anemic, intelligent, but always sensitive and often weak. Sometimes we meet with it in undersized, thin, weak, pale patients who are subject to headache and backache and cannot bear any strain, mental or physical. In such patients, cure is unlikely. Another writer claims that women who complained of pelvic pain or period pain were either delicate girls of feeble condition or women who lead an inactive life. Now, importantly, menstrual pain often developed in women who, although married, had apparently come to regard marriage as, and you'll see on the quote there, a positive evil, producing congestion in a malformed organ and giving rise, in turn, to a train of distressing symptoms. So the doctor's role was to reassure women that their pain was either trivial or imagined or both, or a consequence of some kind of disordered relation to normative gender roles. A number of historians have conducted studies of gynecological tests and obstetrics texts commonly used by doctors throughout the 20th century and beyond. As I'm sure you'll all know, approaches to women's pain in general and to dysmenorrhea in particular have shifted over time. But stereotypes and problematic accounts of what complaints of pain mean haven't disappeared entirely. The general consensus is that there was a shift in approach post-Freud in which unexplained physical symptoms came to be attributed quite squarely to psychological functioning, including in particular hysteria. So, for instance, one textbook from the 1970s described dysmenorrhea as, quote, a symptom of a personality disorder, even though hormonal imbalance may be present. In Barbara Ehrenreich and Deirdre English's classic 1978 book, For Her Own Good, it was said that the theories which guided doctors' practice from the late 19th century to the early 20th century held that women's normal state was to be sick. Thus, pain moved from being dismissed altogether to being trivialised as a result of its normalisation. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual 3, which was published by the American Psychiatric Association in the late 1980s, included criteria for so-called somatization disorder, a concept that has been described as a more recent replacement for hysteria generally. This disorder included dysmenorrhea, and although the more recent 5th edition of the DSM discards dysmenorrhea in the revised classification of somatic symptom disorder, the ICD-10 still includes dysmenorrhea under other somatoform disorders. So as these few examples show, ideas about women's psychological makeup and temperament have long shaped and indeed continue to shape how women's pain is talked about and studied, as well as the amount of investment in research on it and how much of a problem it is thought to be, as well, of course, as what kind of a problem it's understood to be. And all of this, of course, becomes circular in terms of logics and investigations of outcomes, as well as the extent to which there is even an appetite to study dysmenorrhea at all. So in this sense, questions of what is normal or natural matter a great deal and can shape every aspect of problematization. Extremely consequential in this respect is stigma, which operates as a pervasive force, shaping how women, families, communities, and healthcare professionals of all kinds come to understand problems and to address them. Modern interest in stigma harks back to the writings of the sociologist Irving Goffman, who described stigma or defined stigma as an attribute that is deeply discrediting. It is any socially devalued characteristic or attribute serving to reduce an individual from a whole and usual person to a tainted or discounted one. Researchers have found that there are at least 93 different identities, conditions, or attributes that are the target of stigma. And so stigma in this sense is a universal problem. It's one to which many of us can probably relate. It's likely that most of us will have had a stigmatizing experience at some stage, whether it's because of our sex or gender identity, ethnicity, age, class background, educational status, religious beliefs, and so on. And menstruation, of course, is one such condition that can attract stigma. Now, Goffman's approach to stigma has been long debated over the years since he first wrote about it. One important critique of the original stigma concept that I think is worth mentioning here is the sense or the argument that Goffman's approach essentially naturalizes stigma by presenting it as almost inevitable or a virtually automatic result of someone possessing a certain attribute. So in other words, some have argued that if a person has a certain attribute, such as me being a woman, for instance, one possible interpretation of Goffman's work is that this attribute naturally or automatically exposes me to stigma, as if by a kind of magic. Thinking about stigma, therefore, as an intrinsic attribute is problematic because it raises questions about whether we could ever do anything to address or eradicate it. And so experts over time have sought to modify Goffman's stigma concept, arguing instead that stigma is best thought of as a process that involves a series of steps, where differences are first distinguished and labelled, then associated with negative attributes, which is the process of stereotyping, followed by separation according to difference, i.e. separating groups into us versus them, status loss, and then discrimination. Importantly, within this approach, each step is shaped through social, economic, and political power differentials. So a crucial point here is that work must be done at all stages and times to sustain these meanings and experiences and to sustain stigma as a phenomenon. I talk about stigma here because the effects of stigma can last a lifetime, not only because stigma can lead to social exclusion and isolation, but because people often carry stigma with them, including through a process of what we call internalized stigma. Now, this doesn't mean that it's a person's own fault that stigma has become internalized, to be clear, and that's a very important point. Rather, the point is that repeated experiences of stigma can structure and shape a person's orientation to the world and the extent to which they feel safe, supported, judged, or denigrated in all of their encounters with others. It also shapes how they come to understand themselves and their own bodies, including whether they experience themselves as exaggerating, being overly sensitive, even hysterical, or if they see themselves as deserving of care at all. Now, these problems can be even more acute for some groups, such as LGBT women, women from working class backgrounds, or women of colour, where multiple forms of stigma might be in operation, exacerbating their challenges in various ways. And so here, many things come to matter, including how women are taught to think about and feel about their bodies, as well as their rights in their own families, communities, schools, and workplaces. It matters whether employers have, for example, a positive environment to support menstrual health and rights, including through what have been described as stigma-sensitive policies and practices. Now, we now suspect that something between 5 and 9 out of every 10 reproductive aged women experience primary dysmenorrhea. Multiple studies estimate prevalence at around 75% of women. Reported prevalence is higher in women aged up to 24 years, perhaps as high as 95%. It's important to acknowledge that some experience it as mild, others as moderate, and some as severe. Maybe 10 to 20% have no menstrual pain whatsoever, perhaps 20 to 50% have mild pain, 30 to 40% have moderate pain, and 10 to 20% of women report their pain as severe. Research shows that dysmenorrhea impacts quality of life and can affect all aspects of a woman's life, including capacity for school, tertiary education and work, as well as sport and socialisation. I first gave this talk at the IASP World Congress on Pain in the Netherlands and noted when preparing my talk that a 2019 study of over 32,000 women in the Netherlands had found that 13.8% reported absenteeism during their period, with 3.4% absent on every or almost every cycle, losing about 1 to 2 days a month. A total of 80.7% reported presenteeism and decreased productivity of about 2 days a month. Indeed, dysmenorrhea is the leading cause of absenteeism among reproductive aged women. And in Australia, where I am based, the estimated annual economic burden of these symptoms alone is over 14 billion Australian dollars. That's per year. The World Health Organization has stated that menstrual health generally needs to be recognised and framed as a human rights issue. And there are legal precedents in some fields that now position stigma as a violation of human rights, including menstrual stigma. So there are various pressing reasons, in other words, why starting to think about and address these issues, both in terms of a matter of stigma and in terms of a human rights issue, really matters. Of course, our ability to research and resolve these problems is tied up with broader political, social, and legal concerns. Being able to study menstrual cycles is a challenge in many contexts, both because of stigma and because of other challenges, including, for instance, what it might mean to ask women to tell us about their cycles and fertility, to ask them to use tracking apps, period diaries, or other devices, particularly in contexts where reproductive rights and freedoms are under attack, and women are understandably cautious about allowing their bodies to be carefully monitored in these ways. In this sense, we are perhaps moving from a situation where there was little appetite historically to study women's health concerns at all, to one in which the need to do so is increasingly obvious, but where systemic and structural issues shape our capacity to do so. These various politics of data generation invite serious reflection on our own roles as researchers. Do we need to more actively advocate for systems change, especially in those settings where attacks on bodily autonomy and reproductive freedom arguably curtail our ability to advance the basic human rights to healthcare that women and girls should enjoy? I want to include on a more positive note with an example of innovative work in this space. So in my home state of Victoria in Australia, our government has recently announced a wide-ranging program on women's health and well-being. This includes, among other things, the establishment of a landmark public inquiry into women's pain. I'm honoured to be the deputy chair of that inquiry, although I'm not speaking here as an official representative of the pain inquiry or the government. But I do want to tell you a bit about this work and why I think it's so valuable. The inquiry has provided an opportunity for members of the public, women and girls, clinicians and organisations to share their views on the management of women's pain, including their own experiences with pain of various kinds. The government has positioned the inquiry as being a response to the so-called gender pain gap. The inquiry is not confined to dysmenorrhea, to be clear, but we know from preliminary work preceding the launch of the inquiry, including a major public survey on women's health, that around 50% of participants reported menstruation-related conditions affecting their health and well-being, often with significant daily impacts. The inquiry has invited women and girls to tell their stories anonymously, and in this sense are providing a platform for women and girls to be heard, or for what the scholar Miranda Fricker might call epistemic justice. Her concept is about giving historically marginalised groups who are not seen as credible or legitimate claims makers the opportunity to be heard and to be recognised. The inquiry will result in a report and recommendations and has the potential to set a global example for governments on how to address and recognise both historic and present problems of the type I've been describing here, while looking at how ideas about women's bodies and temperaments shape how women receive care. I'm recording this talk in April 2025, and that work will be forthcoming, so please do look for it. But thanks so much otherwise for listening today.